There was an interesting switch in the corporate structure a couple of decades ago. The role that used to be known as director of sales has now become chief revenue officer. And with that change has come a change in the level of responsibility. Pleasure to be joined by Raghu Iyengar, the professor of marketing here at the Wharton School, who is also academic director of the chief revenue officer program at Wharton. Raghu, great to talk to you again. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Dan. Pleasure to see you and great to be back here.
Thank you. I guess let's go back in time first. Why did we see this shift in how this job was actually named in the first place?
I think what companies overall found out that at some point they needed to be a person in charge of all the revenues across the board. I think when you think about companies usually working in silos, that's true. Marketing was optimizing its own thing, product design was doing its own thing, and so on and so forth. So I think at some point the companies realized that there is too much sort of trade-offs happening within the company,
Right.
and they needed to be somebody who could see the overall view as opposed to just the parts.
And I think a lot of people would probably say, okay, well, sales pretty much takes care of that. But you forget that there's a lot of finance involved in the marketing with partnerships and sales, et cetera, and within the department itself.
Indeed. I mean, I think what you find actually is a lot of the CROs initially were coming from sales. But as you just rightly mentioned, I think when you think about, for example, different sources of revenue, it could be about making good new products. It could be doing better marketing, so to speak, finding the right customers. It could be thinking carefully about how you can clean up the P&L, so to speak.
Right.
And so there are lots of other functions involved in the CRO. Well, while salespeople were the right funnel, so to speak, they had to expand their horizon.
But one of the more important parts of that title may be the C part of it, because you're putting this person in the C suite, and
Correct.
that puts them in kind of, I would think, a much different level than if they were just the director of sales.
Absolutely. I think it was Uncle Ben who said in Spider-Man, with I don't know, with big power comes big responsibility or something like that.
Yep.
Absolutely true. I think again, if you think about it from a company's perspective, you can't somehow give a person all the responsibilities, but somehow not elevate, quote unquote, the value of that person, because again, they may face trade-offs within the company. And so I think rightfully so, sort of the C suite, I think, gives them the responsibilities, but also the necessary uh, sort of ways in which they can go about implementing what they want.
How common is it now where companies have a CRO? And are there specific types of companies, depending on maybe size,
Yeah.
where you may have a CRO or you may not have one?
Great point. And so I think if you think about last few years, I think typically I'll start with the second question first. Typically, you have the mid-sized companies that are looking into CROs just because I think it's just easier to manage within the company. Larger the company, the more silos you have, and the harder it becomes to cut through them. But having said that, you actually see companies like Salesforce, for example, that dabbled with a CRO. Zoom has a CRO. Even OpenAI more recently had gotten a CRO. And again, if you think about all of these companies, they are across the board, but you do find on average, mid-sized companies are the ones that are currently sort of increasing that trend of having a CRO.
And is the onset of artificial intelligence playing a role in that position, especially as a lot more of not only the companies, but the departments within the company are obviously having to have AI as part of their operations?
Indeed. I mean, I think if you think about it, if anything, the CRO role becomes even more important. The way I think about AI these days is that it is an accelerator. That's great, but it can accelerate bad decisions too. And so thinking carefully about how much investment one should make in AI, where should that investment be? How would we gather the ROI on that investment? All of those things fall under the purview of the CRO
You
because it's about risk and return.
you mentioned a little bit ago that the CRO many cases kind of came from being director of sales. But now that we are a couple of decades down the path here, what are the qualifications we're seeing for a person who is a CRO in this day and age?
So, as you rightly said, I think earlier it was sales, but I think now you're actually seeing CROs who are coming from being, let's say, growth officers, so to speak, chief growth officer, if you want to call it that. There are people who are coming in from marketing who have a very good knowledge of especially digital marketing these days. And so I think the spectrum has increased. But I think one big qualification, so to speak, if I had to think about it, is somebody who has a holistic view of the organization, somebody who is not sort of very much biased towards one or the other silo, but kind of looks at different ways in which they can interact with each other in positive ways.
And really, isn't that a component of being a part of the C-suite anyway, having that larger scale view?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is a C attached to it, because I think that also exposes the individual to all the different facets of the company. And if you want to take that bigger responsibility, you need to understand that as you're trying to grow the revenue, perhaps there'll be different parts of the organization that may not be happy with it because it's coming at their expense. But that's the sort of the responsibility of the CRO to see the bigger picture as opposed to quote unquote the parts.
Do you see the role of the CRO being one that continues to develop in the years ahead? Or is the structure of what we see now in this position kind of what the framework of it will be as we move forward?
I think it will develop. I think one thing that will remain the same, though, is this overall view, so to speak, which is somebody who kind of has a holistic view of the organization. An analogy that I can give here is, when you think about how analytics grew within companies, there was this whole idea of should it be a hub and spoke model, like having a center of excellence, and then there might be other people in different parts. Should each function have their own analytics center, so to speak? I think all of these are natural changes that happen as you sort of have more and more decisions within a particular sort of organization. And I think that's what would happen with the CRO. I think over time, things will evolve because there might be new sources of revenue. There might be new ways in which organizations are set up. But the holistic view, I think, will remain constant.
Is it safe to say, though, that this change from maybe sales director to where it is right now has been a very important one when you think about all the development that companies have had in the last couple of decades, all the technological changes, and the fact that you do need to have kind of that outside view of all of these different departments that could fall under the CRO's kind of role.
Indeed. I mean, I think salespeople obviously are very, very good at what they do. But I think, with the nature of it and the kind of everyday decisions they have to make, it is primarily in sales. But then when you think about the revenues, it may be obviously coming from sales, but there are other ways in which revenues can come. And sometimes when you take on that bigger role, you start seeing the trade offs of just focusing on sales
Right.
because that might be one viable path, but there are obviously many, many other paths as well.
And it's also important for that person to be able to, let's say you have kind of 4 silos underneath that CRO, to be able to have one work with another or one work with 2 others and be able to navigate a lot of the issues that could pop up.
Indeed. I mean, I was just on a different note, I was just reading and listening to a history channel about World War II and how Dwight Eisenhower, even, he was an accomplished, apart from just being a person in the army, he was an accomplished sort of mediator.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important because you have to mediate and make sure that every part works together.
Raghu, great to have you with us. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Always great to have you with us. Raghu Iyengar, marketing professor here at the Wharton School and academic director of the Chief Revenue Officer program at Wharton.